Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Hey gang, just wanted to thank you for checking out the channel and listening to this episode. Going to the Wayback Machine again, and these are stories that I have never read on my channel. They may have appeared on many others, but I thought I would continue on with my series that I do every once in a while, Tales from the Vault. Enjoy. I don't know what it was. Growing up, I lived in the middle of the woods. There were no neighbors for about a mile on either side of us, and we owned 60 acres of forest, and then a swamp after that. So basically, I lived in the middle of nowhere. One summer, when I was about 14, I was out in the middle of the woods playing with my dog. I'm an only child, and both of my parents were out of town, and I kept feeling something hit my elbow. I'd go to throw Max's ball, and this bump would make me throw it almost straight up. Assuming it was just me bumping it on trees or something, I ignored the bumping. But after the third or fourth time of it happening, I thought, this sucks. Let's just go home. But walking back to the house, I felt uneasy. I tried to reassure myself that I was just freaking myself out because we were alone. About an hour later, Max and I were at home on the couch when the garage door opened, and Max started barking his head off. I hopped up to let my mom or dad in, thinking that they were home really early. I peered through the peephole and saw the door was still shut, and no one was in the garage. I quieted Max down and I opened the door slowly and called out for my dad. Nothing. No response at all. So I went out to check the door, and it was still locked. Okay, sure. Weird, but oh well. I mean, at least Max heard it too, so I knew I wasn't crazy. We went back to the couch, and about 20 minutes later, I heard the door open again. And that time, Max started growling like crazy. I quieted him down again and just assumed it was the wind or something making noise. But by that point, my heart was racing. That's when I heard footsteps come up the stairs and thought, oh, geez, Dad really is home this time. And I hopped up and ran to the door. The door handle started to jiggle, so I ran even faster to let my dad in. I peeped through the hole again, and even though my hand was loosely holding on to the door handle, it kept jiggling. But when I looked through the peephole, there was no one on the other side of the door. Terrified, I hid on the couch with all of the lights on. Max was still growling. About an hour after that, I started to feel a little better, even though I was pretty terrified. But then I heard the door handle jiggle again. This time it was Max jiggling it. He needed to go outside, and the only way outside was through the garage. Fantastic. I literally sprinted with him to our kennel, and as I was standing there, I decided to ask this thing, whatever it was out there, questions to make myself feel better, because I knew it wouldn't answer me. Thinking about what to ask it, my eyes were drawn to a huge heavy oak door on the kennel. It was always open because it was too heavy for me to move easily. At any rate, I said, okay, ghost, if you're real, you'll shut this heavy door. I waited. Nothing happened. A minute or so went by. Still, nothing happened, and Max was just sniffing around. I turned around to him and yelled at him to hurry up. And then from behind me, I heard it. I whipped around and saw the giant door swing shut and latch itself. Okay, clearly it was just the wind. No, it wasn't really windy, but it was the wind for sure. It had to be. I kept telling myself that over and over. I proceeded. Okay, ghost, that was the wind. If you're really real, you'll open the door back up. I waited, and nothing happened. I relaxed a bit and then squatted down with my head on my knees, reminiscing about how lame I was just being scared, when I heard the door. It was now wide open again. Max was done doing his business, so we just booked it back into the house and locked every single door. For the next 4 hours, I heard footsteps on the stairs and the door handle to the garage jiggling every few minutes, until finally around 11 p.m., my dad walked in and yelled at me for wasting electricity. I never told him or my mom about what happened until about 4 months later, when my dad came in from hunting. By the time he got home, it was dark, but he looked shaken, and I asked him what was wrong. He said he had aimed at 2 deer out in the woods, but missed both completely, because it felt as if something was hitting his elbow and making him shoot way above the deer. That's when I told him everything. He just looked at me knowingly, and we never spoke about it again. Who was there? When I was 11 years old, my older brother and I shared a room. He was a senior in high school at the time and was out at parties on most weekends. One particular night, I woke up around 2:30 in the morning when I heard some rustling in his bed, and I assumed he was just getting home from a party. It sounded like he was just rolling over in bed. I had heard his car pull up and where the dog started barking, so it struck me as a little strange that the rustling would wake me up. It made me feel slightly uncomfortable for some reason. This went on for about 30 seconds before I finally opened my eyes to take a look. I couldn't exactly see him, but there was something definitely under his blankets that looked like a person, and it was just rolling over and over. I watched it for about a minute longer before I started to get freaked out. So I called his name loudly and told him to shut up and get some sleep already. He didn't answer me back. Another 30 seconds or so, I got out of bed and threw a shoe at whoever was under the blankets, but he didn't stop rolling around, so I called my brother's name again and then threw another shoe. He still didn't respond, which really freaked me out. So I wrapped myself under my blankets and tried to make myself fall asleep. I definitely remember listening to whoever it was for at least another 30 minutes, and I hoped whoever it was wouldn't get out of the other bed, including my brother. I was concentrating on just trying to make myself fall asleep. When I woke up the next morning, my brother's bed was perfectly made with the shoes placed perfectly on his pillow. When I asked my mom where my brother was that morning, she told me that he hadn't gotten home yet, that he'd stayed over at a friend's house after a party. Yeah, I know this story sounds cheesy and fake, but I'll never forget how scared I was. This really happened, and it still freaks me out to think about it. The man knocking. So yesterday, I was home alone with only my younger brother for company. That's normally fine. My brother is 14 and has already overtaken me in height, so I don't feel the need to regularly check up on him or anything. Keep in mind, I live in a relatively safe suburban area, and despite a few weird encounters while I've walked home through the woods, I've never really felt at risk. That is, until yesterday. Around lunchtime, I was up in my room when I heard knocks on the door. And not just one knock, but repeated knocks getting louder and louder and more frequent. To help explain why this was so creepy, we have a front porch, the first door being glass and the second solid wood. The knocks were on the wooden door, which meant that that person had opened the first door and actually kind of entered the house. I was freaked out. But given that I couldn't see who was outside without being able to see myself, I just left it alone, and the knocking stopped after about 5 minutes. About an hour later, someone was knocking on the door again, but this time only twice. But again, I just left it and forgot about it until my dad came home. He got home around 6, and as soon as he came in, he ran straight up to my room and asked if I was okay, or had I seen anything unusual. Obviously, I told him what had happened, and he explained what he had just heard from the neighbors across the street. They had been looking out their window to see a man standing outside my house, staring right at it for about an hour. I mean, that was odd enough, until my dad told me that the reason they had come over to check on us so much later was because even after the first set of knocking stopped, the man had stayed outside our house, looking in the windows, etc., for half an hour or so before finally leaving. What was worse about this is that the man knew my brother was home, as his room is at the front of the house and he could be seen easily through the window. Ben was completely oblivious to all of that because he'd been absorbed in his computer game, so much that he didn't even hear the knocking. My dad went back outside to check around the house and came back inside holding something. It was an axe, an old axe that had been left just outside the front of our house, and it was not ours. The fourth floor. I was in Taiwan one year when I was younger, and I had traveled to a busy night market. There are popular gatherings of food and shops and that usually operate in the evenings. Nearby, I spotted a sign for a net cafe in a 5 to 6 story tall building. Thinking I'd take some time and fire off some quick emails, I walked into the dark, small entrance of the building. The building was older and hadn't been well maintained, but it wasn't out of the ordinary in Taiwan. The entrance just had a dark hallway that led to a small elevator. So I pressed the elevator call button and entered. The elevator was uncharacteristically new compared to the rest of the building, but I didn't think much of it. Like some Chinese and Taiwanese buildings, there wasn't a fourth floor. It's considered bad luck since 4 sounds like death, so the buttons just read 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6, which was usual. I looked for the floor the net cafe was at, the 6th floor, and pressed the button. It lurched into action quietly, and I began to ascend. When the elevator stopped, I figured it was on my floor, so I instinctively began to step out. Right before stepping out, however, the sign outside the elevator stopped me. It was pitch dark, only lit by the light from the elevator. It looked like this floor hadn't been occupied for decades. There were some random pieces of furniture covered with white cloths or something similar to that. It was a small building, so each floor was single occupancy, and I could see pretty much the entire floor from the elevator. Thinking I must have gotten out on the wrong floor, I checked the light, the one that indicates which floor you're on. And strangely, there was nothing. None of the indicators were on at all, but the floor button to the net cafe was still lit, so I knew I hadn't gotten there yet. All of this happened within a couple of seconds. It's when I noticed a figure moving the distance of the floor. It wasn't very visible, but I could make out what looked like a person dressed in some kind of gown, moving slowly toward the elevator where I was. I was thoroughly creeped out, so I started pressing the closed door button rapidly. As soon as I pressed it, the elevator light flickered off, and I was in pitch dark. I was this close to pissing my pants, and it's actually kind of freaking me out right now even thinking back to it. The lights flickered back on, and under a second, the door closed. The elevator jolted back to life, and a few moments later, the doors opened to the net cafe. I was beyond relieved at that point. I immediately walked out and sat down at a computer. After taking a moment to gather my wits, I walked over to the cashier's desk and told them what I had just seen. The girl working there listened, and her face turned a bit ashen. So I asked her if she had heard of anything similar ever happening to anyone else. She told me that she'd never experienced it, but some coworkers and occasional customers had brought it up. Basically, the building has 6 floors, and the 4th floor had a history. Apparently, it used to be a hair salon of sorts until one of the employees killed herself there for some reason. She slit her wrists over their hair washing station and died. The store continued operations after her death, despite stories of weird appearances being reported. When customers got their hair rinsed, the water would look a little red, like the customer was bleeding. Little things like that. And a couple of people reported seeing someone's figure walking away in the mirror, but wouldn't see anyone when they turned to check. Naturally, the business closed down a few months later, and the building owner tried to re-rent the place out, but never had any luck. Most businesses are quite superstitious, and no one wanted to rent the fourth floor after someone had died in it, even at a very cheap price. Eventually, after dropping the price to nearly nothing, a stationery supply store wanted to rent it. During the renovations of the floor, however, several accidents happened, and this would end up in strange places. A mirror from the previous business shattered when no one was near it, and finally, a worker had his hand jammed between the elevator doors when it closed on him unexpectedly. It doesn't sound so bad in print, but I guess the guy's hand got really messed up. Well, the workers refused to continue working, and finally the business just left, and the building owner finally gave up and shut down the floor. He then had the elevator company come in to replace the panel, so that the elevator could not go to the fourth floor. Let me repeat that. The elevator was programmed to never go to the fourth floor. It didn't even have a button. But for some reason, sometimes when people did take the elevator, it would go to the fourth floor and the doors would open. And sometimes, like myself, those folks would see a figure walking around in the dark. Creep on the road. So, I live in an area that's considered relatively dangerous. So much so, in fact, that kids are taught regularly in schools what to do in dangerous situations, such as being abducted or break-ins, etc. When I was 18 or 19 years old, being armed with this knowledge and pepper spray, I felt that I could handle myself. Admittedly, the decisions I made were still incredibly stupid. For instance, there was a certain very long road without streetlights that I would walk at 3 a.m. to meet with friends in a nearby neighborhood. I say nearby, but it was actually a 15-minute drive. The walk was obviously much longer. On that road is where my story begins. I was walking back home alone after seeing my friends at maybe 5 or 6 a.m., taking in the soft breeze and enjoying the forestry around me. The road was mostly empty and was most of the time, as there are many houses and it was early. Naturally, I wasn't used to being harassed or bothered on that road at that time in the morning. But as I was passing a familiar house on the stretch, headlights slowly flooded the street. I glanced back to see an old, faded blue car creeping around a blind turn. That didn't frighten me, as that's how a lot of people drove in that neighborhood when they were way too high. I just shrugged, figuring that it was just some ridiculous stoner. And that's when I heard it. The sound of the car picking up speed, and goosebumps went up my spine. I took a deep breath, reminded myself that I had my phone and pepper spray, and then shook the paranoia off. The car got closer, and I heard it slowing down again. I knew it was near me because the shine of the headlights on the road was now in front of me, and that could only mean that the car was now moving alongside me. Now, mind you, I'm small, maybe 5'5" and around 120 pounds, and I was even smaller back then. I was almost too afraid to look over my shoulder, and I was imagining some creepy old bald guy leering at me with a knife. And I happened to glance at the car, and I could barely make out the details of the figure behind the wheel. He was an older man from what I could tell. "Hey there, need a ride?" His voice was raspy but loud. "No thank you," I called back and kept my eyes forward. "Come on, a pretty thing like you shouldn't be out alone when it's dark," he said, and then chuckled. "I'm okay," I said, and I kept my voice level, but I did pick up my pace. I might have been able to take the guy if he were walking, but he had the advantage of being in a car. There was no way I could outrun him. If he decided to run me over with his car, I might have been able to call 911 if I survived. His voice suddenly grew stern. "Get in. I promise I'm not going to rape you or anything." "No, that's okay," I said back, and I shook my head thinking sarcastically, "Oh, that's what you say to convince me that you're not a rapist?" Despite my consistent refusal, the old man still kept beside me, and after a few more minutes I unhooked my pepper spray from the clip that held it on my purse. The man saw that and sped off. As stupid as it is, that didn't discourage me from walking that road late at night still. I figured that I had handled myself well enough and that I'd always be okay. So I continued to take that route, and every night after that I would see the man in the exact same spot. He'd slow down next to me and I'd immediately grab my phone and pepper spray. I'd usually pretend to talk to someone on my cell as he gave me a hard look through his window, and then he'd speed off. After a few mornings of this, I decided to avoid that road at night. I even had to stop hanging out with those friends as they were night owls and were usually asleep during the day. Fast forward 3 years. Last week, I saw in an alarming article on my Facebook newsfeed. On that road near that familiar house, the exact spot where the creeper would always try to bother me, the police found something that made me sick. They found a body in a cardboard box just off the road. It wasn't even hidden. Now, I'm not sure if it was the same guy, but I can't shake the feeling that it could have been me in that box. However, I don't think the police have ever caught the murderer yet. I've gotten more careful since then, and I don't go out at night unless I have someone with me, and I now have a taser. But still, creepy old guy who is quite possibly a murderer? Let's not ever meet again. Ghost Girl. So, a while back, my mom lived in this house on Brindle Mountain. The landlord of the place was super anal about making sure they didn't do any remodeling or repairs. He didn't want anything changed, and it was odd to say the least. After a while, my mom and stepdad started saying that they thought the place was haunted by the ghost of a small girl. They said sometimes they would see the shadow of a girl walk from room to room, or hear playing in the back when no one was back there. And sometimes it sounded like a small child was sobbing, but they couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. So, me being an atheist at the time kind of blew it off. I was like, yeah, right. Anyway, this was towards the end of me and my now ex-wife's relationship. When we split up, I started living with my mom until I got back on my feet. We shared custody of our daughter 50-50, so one week she'd stay with me until Friday, and then she'd go to her house until the following Friday, and then she'd come back with me. Simple, right? Anyway, it was a Saturday night and I was on the computer. It was probably like 2 a.m. I was just surfing music. The computer desk was in the kitchen facing a wall, and on that wall was the doorway that led to the bedrooms. So if anyone came out of bed to get something from the kitchen, they would have to walk right past me. My little girl was always getting up in the night and getting into trouble. She'd raid the fridge or knock something over climbing up on something. She liked to get up in the night and raid the kitchen because she knew everyone was asleep and she could get away with it. Uncle Josh note, yeah, I hear that in spades, brother. So this particular night, I happened to be up and on the computer. I saw my daughter sneak into the kitchen out of my peripheral vision, and she just froze when she saw me and stood there. I didn't look directly at her or pay her any attention. I figured she had seen me, and she knew she was caught. I thought, hopefully she'll go back to bed and go to sleep without me having to make a big deal out of anything. But she stood there for about 3 minutes. I could see her the whole time, but I made a point to not look right at her so that she would just go back to bed. She eventually turned and walked back towards the bedroom. It was dark in that room, but I could still see her turn and leave. And everything was dead silent after that. So after about 15 minutes, I got that feeling in my gut that all parents get when their kids are too quiet. I decided that I needed to check on her because she was probably up to no good. In 15 minutes, I should have heard her climb back into bed or even rustling through her toys. I stood up and walked into the next room that led to the bedrooms. It was pitch black. I couldn't see a thing. And then I stopped dead in my tracks. The hair on my neck stood up and I got a sick feeling in my stomach. That's when it hit me. My daughter was with her mother that night, not with me. It still gives me chills thinking about that. I was targeted. This took place 14 years ago when I was 15. I grew up in a not-so-safe suburb of Athens, so in my life I unfortunately had a few creepy encounters. But this one deserves the prize of the creepiest. One day, I received a text message from an unknown number in my phone from a boy, let's call him John. He said he was a guy from my school and that he liked me very much, but was too shy to come and talk to me. So, through whatever means, he found my number, but he wouldn't tell me how. I was not flattered at all, basically because I've always been a shy and very private person, so I kind of felt like he invaded my personal space. Anyway, I decided to turn my mobile off and have a good night's sleep with the hope that he would get the message that I was not interested, and I hoped he wouldn't text me again. The next day, I woke up to find 10 messages in my phone. Some of them were romantic song lyrics, and some of them were him begging me to give him a chance and to meet him. To tell you the truth, at that point it crossed my mind that my classmates were playing a prank on me, because I was not a very popular girl in school, what with my black metal clothes and my sketchbook always in my hands. Well, I got dressed and went to school hoping that they wouldn't be laughing at me behind my back. As soon as I got there, this John messaged me telling me that he really loved the band Behemoth, and my heart started racing because on that particular day, I was wearing my Behemoth t-shirt. I said to myself, okay, that's it, and I texted him that I wanted to meet him. I needed to know who he was and why the hell he was spying on me. Of course, he was more than happy to meet me the same afternoon behind school in a supermarket parking lot, which was really isolated and dangerous. I agreed. My plan, of course, was to arrive earlier and hide behind some huge dumpsters that were there in order to see who he was. That's exactly what I did. But no one was in the lot. I texted him and asked him what he was wearing, and he told me he had long hair and he was wearing a black shirt with a pair of blue jeans. Suddenly, a blue van arrived in the lot and parked very close to the dumpsters that I was hiding behind. 2 middle-aged men got out. One of them was short, bald, and really fat, and the other was bald, tall, and fit. They both looked very clean, and they were wearing black shirts with ties and fancy gray trousers. I immediately called the number John had been texting me from, and the short guy's phone rang. He didn't answer it, but he texted me. "My battery is low. I'm here waiting. Where are you, babe?" I froze with fear. Who were these men? What did they want with me? And how the hell did they know my name, and how did they find my phone number? I acted quickly and wrote down the van's number and called the police, telling them that I was in great danger. A couple of minutes later, I heard a police car coming, and these two quickly got into their van and disappeared. The police tracked the van's number down and found out the vehicle was stolen. They advised me to change my mobile number and promised they would do what they could to find them. After that, my dad started driving me to and from school. The next day at school, one of my friends asked me if my dad had found me the day before and if everything was okay. I was confused. She then explained to me that my dad had showed up outside of school one day and told her that some people had robbed him when they took his mobile phone, amongst other things. He needed my number to call me because he couldn't find me, and he needed to know if I was okay, because he knew that on that particular day I had skipped class, and he was worried. I asked her what the guy looked like, because she had never met my dad before. She told me he was a middle-aged, bald guy, short on the heavy side, and dressed really nice. Now, let me tell you, my dad is a tall, young man with long hair. He kind of looks like Aragorn from The Lord of the Rings. So imagine my terror when she described the man I saw from the van. The first mystery was solved. My friend had made a huge mistake and had mistakenly given a stranger with a totally unconvincing story my phone number. But still, how did those men know my name? How did they know she was one of my very few friends? I had no Facebook or other accounts at the time because I didn't even own a computer. I mean, how the hell did they know all these other details about my life? And the most important thing, what would they have done to me if I had fallen into their trap? The police never found out anything more about them. I never saw them again, but there were times up until now that I've lived abroad, and every once in a while I still get a strange feeling of being watched. I hope it's not them. It all got weird. Everything weird started the night my mom died. All of these events took place in my dad's house, where she suddenly passed away on Christmas in 2000. Our next-door neighbor had a heart attack and died the same day. My mom had gone over to console the family, and afterwards came back to our house and went to bed, where she died 2 hours later. The paramedics were very confused when they had to come back to the same neighborhood twice. That night, after we all returned from the hospital, I slept in the living room. My friend Paco stayed the night with me, and we both woke up in the night at different times, because all of the doorknobs upstairs were rattling. Nobody was upstairs. A couple of years later, my dad was remarried to a horrible witch of a woman. I started opting out of family vacations and staying home by myself because of her, and that's really when the weird stuff started happening in earnest. My girlfriend and I at the time were sitting in the basement about to start watching The Ninth Gate. I started the movie up when I heard a flat thud behind us. There was a shelf above the basement fireplace where we kept a lot of photos, and above that was a clock. The clock had fallen off the wall and landed about 5 feet away from us, from the wall face. No clatter, just a thud, as if someone had picked it up and dropped it flat. Had it fallen off the wall, it would have hit about 3 or 4 things on its way to the floor, including the brick landing around the fireplace. We looked at each other and decided to go upstairs and just forget about the movie. A few months after that, I was home alone sleeping in the living room. My family takes lots of vacations. I turned all the lights off to go to sleep and turned off the TV, and as I closed my eyes, I heard a click in the dining room. I opened my eyes and the lights were on. I was now sure someone was in the house, so I went through the entire thing with a baseball bat, but I didn't find anyone or anything. My dad and this horrible new wife had a baby 2 years later. I came home from school one day and heard the baby crying in my dad's bedroom, like babies do. I hollered, "Dad, I'm home," and went downstairs to drop off my backpack, still hearing the baby crying. I went back upstairs and yelled at my dad again, telling him that I was home. But he didn't answer me, and the baby had stopped crying. So I went into my dad's room to say hi, but there was no one there. No one was in the house at all. I called my dad to see if he had just left, but he told me that they were all up in the city about an hour north, having a late lunch, and they had the baby with them. Over time, our house became infested with brown recluse spiders and wasps. It became a real problem. It's probably unrelated, but it was still really strange, being as there had never been a bug problem prior to my dad getting remarried. Eventually, I moved out of the house and started touring full-time with my band. I would come home between tours and stay at my dad's house, and one night I was staying there, once again by myself, and had the TV on and the lights off. I stepped outside to smoke, and when I came back in, the TV was off and the lights were on. Finally, the last thing that happened to me in that house, this time I wasn't alone. My friend Ben was staying the night with me while I sat the house for my dad while he was in Africa doing mission work. Ben and I went out to grab some drinks and food in town and returned to my house. We never locked the doors because we lived in such a small town, and that's just how it was. About 30 minutes after we returned, maybe around 3:30 a.m., we heard 3 deafening bangs coming from the walls upstairs, 3 bangs in succession. We grabbed the nearest objects that could be used as weapons, since we were sure someone was in the house. But once again, we looked around and there was nothing. I did notice that the noises came from my sister's bedroom. I went in there, and there was a clock face down on the floor. The bangs must have knocked it off the wall. Ben knew about all the other things that had happened to me in that house and said, "Dude, I gotta go. I can't do this. I'm sorry." I begged him to stay, and thankfully he did. We started playing Rock Band and just tried to forget all about it. He told me the next morning that he had woken up later in the night and had sleep paralysis. I've never had that, but man, it sounds awful. That was the last thing that had ever happened to me in that house. My dad and his second wife divorced last year after her substance abuse got out of control and she cheated on him with 3 dudes and then went to rehab. Now that she's out of the house, though, it doesn't feel nearly as scary as it used to. I don't know if there's a connection between that or not. That's just my observation. The woman on the porch. This event didn't happen to me, but rather to my mother. It happened while I was away at summer camp. I'm 21 now, so I'm presuming that I must have been at least 12 or 13. Back before I came to think the camp was stupid and I didn't want anything to do with it. The details may be a bit vague, but it's certainly one of those things that has been singed into my brain. My mother told me about it in the parking lot of a diner, and I distinctly remember asking her why she couldn't just tell me in the diner, as we often share conversations over lunch. She gave me a look and told me that it wasn't a story to be overheard in a restaurant. And let me tell you, it did give me the chills. A little bit of background on my mother. She's always had sleep problems, and if my timeline is correct, this was before she was diagnosed with sleep apnea and restless leg syndrome. One night, she'd woken up between midnight and 1, and she was irritated. She usually took that opportunity to work on our projects or do cleaning that didn't require a lot of crashing around. Not that it mattered, because at the time my father was in the military and serving overseas. About an hour after she had woken up, she heard a knock at our front door. My mom isn't a woman who's easily intimidated, but even the bravest of us get nervous when someone shows up at a door at some obscene hour of the morning, right? She got up and went over to the door. Our porch light was obviously off, so she couldn't see who was there. There was a tiny rectangular window on our main door, so just past the screen on our storm door, she could see a figure standing there in the shadows. After about a minute, she heard a tiny voice through the door say, "Help me." It was then that my mom flipped on the light and discovered that the figure was a young woman, and she was covered in blood. Now that I'm older, I find myself wondering why my mother opened the door in the first place, but I'm supposing that her gut told her that the woman wasn't a threat. And upon further inspection, now that she was no longer looking through what could only be described as a porthole on our door, my mom discovered that the woman had bite marks all over her skin that were visible. My mom told the woman to wait on the porch and ran back into the house and grabbed the phone, quickly dialing 911, and then went back to the woman. For the record, we lived right down the street from our local police station. The details here are a bit vague, but my mom asked the woman what happened to her, and the woman told her that she and a friend had gotten intoxicated and then got into a fight. Things got out of hand, and she had wandered around while the other woman was currently running around our neighborhood buck naked. It was at about this juncture that the woman began to act hysterical, saying something about needing to get back to her dog and her house, and she started to wander off. As the police hadn't arrived yet, my mother didn't want her wandering off. Getting off on a serious note, it was now that my mother embraced her very dominant personality and barked at the woman, and in my mother's exact words, that the woman sit down, and the woman obeyed. Not too long later, policemen arrived and asked the woman about what had happened, so she had to repeat herself. An ambulance took the woman away, but our porch was now covered in gore, and my mom had to get into the house via the back door. Luckily, the crime scene guys showed up the next day to clean up the mess. My mom joked that our porch had never looked cleaner. Now, I had always been a weird child, so I remember telling her, probably in just the time, that I wished I had been there to see it. She solemnly shook her head and said she was glad I wasn't. And now that I am older, quite frankly, I'm really glad I wasn't there. Shadows. When I was 14, my family and I fell on hard times. We had gotten kicked out of our house and ended up in emergency housing. Basically, we went to a charity who found us a house that we were able to rent for $100 a month, but only for 3 months. That summer, my mom and dad had separated temporarily, and my 3 younger siblings went to my stepdad's for a week or so, and then they came back to my mom and me. I do have to say, the house we were renting was fucking creepy. It started off with just that feeling, like something isn't quite right, that you might not be the only person in the room. In the day, that's all it was. The feeling that something was up, like your instincts were pricking at you. And I tried to ignore it, but as soon as dusk arrived, shit would start happening. More than once, I could hear this static-filled music playing, but I couldn't find the source, and it just filled the halls. I heard whispering and went to my 2 sisters' room, and in the open closet, I swear I saw a pair of eyes looking at me that quickly disappeared. My brother spent 1 night in the house and never went back. In my room, I could never win. There was a mirror on one wall. One night, when I flipped over to face the window, I watched tall shadow figures pacing in front of it. In my mother's room, the same shadow figures paced in circles around her room. One night, she and I sat up for 2 hours in her bed watching these shadows. She was very religious and didn't know what to make of it. During the time we lived there was a lunar eclipse. I'd never seen one before and was very excited for it. When I went out to look, this terror took over me and I couldn't stay outside. I just couldn't explain it. But when the moon was fully cloaked, I went outside and looked up. but my head suddenly snapped down to my left. I could see 3 tall shadows walking in between the tall pine trees in the yard. Panicked, I ran back inside and into my room, flinging myself under the covers with my eyes shut tightly. But I kept listening to the pacing outside my bedroom window. It was 3 months of this. We moved out at the end of the summer into a new house. My mom and stepdad got back together, and I was with my younger siblings again. We all agreed that that house on Acorn Street was fucked up, and I still get chills when we drive by it. My siblings and I all agree, and even my mom to a point, that that place wasn't right. It felt like it went beyond just ghosts. The mirror was something different. I forgot to explain that initially. In it, I could see my room, and sometimes it would be the shadows pacing, not like in front of my window, but as if they were in the mirror itself. Once or twice I would sneak a glance at the mirror, and there would be a shadow stopped right in my mirror as if it were looking down at me laying on my bed. Once I looked, and I didn't see the shadow figures, but darkened forms that seemed to grow darker as I looked at them, just sitting on my bed and standing in my room. That was the last time I looked at the mirror, I think. I always made an effort to avoid it. I sensed these things not with my psyche or any third eye, but with my physical eyes. I could hear the shadow forms pacing as they had feet. The walls were thin and the windows didn't have proper seals in the house, so I could hear the wind blow or the rain fall as the window was never fully closed. That meant I also heard the shadows when they paced around my house, like every night. No amount of prayers I had, as my mom suggested I do, had any effect on these things that I felt and saw. The house was just unnerving, frightening. I've lived in houses before and after that had more ghostly-type symptoms, I guess. But the restless feeling, the things moving, the lights turning on or off, or the doors opening and closing on their own, I've always been sensitive to those things. I can't explain why. But that house, the house on Acorn Street, was something different entirely. It was beyond my capacity to understand or even will myself to explore more about it. It still fills me with a sense of dread, thinking about it now. The lights. I grew up in the Arctic. In the town I lived in, as long as it was a clear night, it was an extremely normal occurrence to see all sorts of strange lights move across the sky. Keep in mind, the winter is long in the Arctic, which means longer amounts of time being spent under the stars. It's quite beautiful as long as you don't mind the cold so much. Sometimes I would drive a snowmobile a few kilometers out of town, shut it down, and just lay down on the snow looking up at the sky and the majesty of it all. The only thing disturbing the silence was the occasional breeze. The northern lights are also a common occurrence. I mean, it doesn't happen every day, but it happens often enough that they start getting ignored after a while, as long as they aren't too spectacular anyway. On one night, without asking my parents, it was their snowmobile, I decided to go out on one of my midnight drives out of town. I drove a few kilometers over the hills to find a spot devoid of light pollution from town. I shut off the machine and settled into a good spot to look up and be retrospective. It wasn't all that interesting seeing a few satellites passing here and there, some relatively boring activity affecting the magnetic field, and so on. But then I started noticing a clicking noise. At first I thought it was the sound of the snow machine cooling down as the engine expanded and contracted along with the cold. But the source of the sound definitely wasn't coming from that direction. My next thought was there must be an animal nearby, in which case I needed to get out of there fast. You really don't want to mess with a wild animal. But the clicking was far too regular for it to be an animal to produce it. It was fairly mechanical sounding, and again the source of the sound wasn't coming from anywhere around me laterally. I noticed it was coming from up. So naturally, I looked up, determined to ascertain the origin of this strange noise. But I saw what I always saw. Stars, northern lights, a lazy satellite crossing the sky. All normal stuff. Now, before I dismissed it altogether and began heading home, I did notice something strange in the aurora borealis. There were 3 rather strong points of light, and I ignored them at first, thinking they were just oddly symmetrical stars. But that was proved false. They were definitely getting brighter. I kept staring in morbid fascination that grew stronger and stronger. It was still the only remaining single points in the sky, and all the while, that clicking noise was getting louder and louder and more pronounced, almost like someone tapping a pin on a desk or clacking billiard balls together inside my head. Then everything stopped. The lights were gone, I couldn't hear the clicking anymore, and aside from being a little stiff, cold, and rather petrified, I was fine. So I jumped back onto the snow machine thinking maybe I was just going crazy. But the machine took a little longer than usual to start up, and I was beginning to worry. But soon it was up and running and I was heading back towards town. As I was driving back, several plausible scenarios as to what occurred were running through my head. I'm thinking it could have been a helicopter from the mine or some strange northern lights behavior, etc. Probably not that much of a big deal. I pulled up to my house and the lights were all off, but it was strange. It wasn't that late when I left. I opened the outer door as quietly as possible, removed my winter gear, and entered the inner door. The house was quiet, like really quiet. My parents are teachers and usually stayed up pretty late working on papers or correcting things for school, or maybe watching TV. But all I was thinking was that I had to get into bed without anyone noticing. That proved to actually happen pretty easily, and soon I was under my covers, and I went to set my alarm for the next day. But then all of a sudden, everything made sense. Why the engine was so hard to start. Why I felt stiff rather than chilly. Why no one was up when I was gone, and it felt like a relatively short period of time that I was gone. It was almost 11 p.m. when I had left for my adventure, and now it was creeping up on 6 a.m. I had stood out there in the snow, listening to those clicking sounds and staring at those lights for almost 7 hours. I didn't end up falling asleep for the rest of that night and morning, and I don't go on late snow machine rides anymore. The new house. When I was little, my parents divorced and I went to live with my dad as he was moving to a new town. We ended up buying this big house out in the country outside of a little podunk town. The house was huge for the two of us, but it was right on a little pond with an island on it, so that was cool. There were other houses around, but it was basically surrounded by cornfields, which scared the fuck out of me because of the movie Children of the Corn. That had just come out. That movie terrifies me to this day. I'm old as shit. Anyway, the freaky shit started happening almost immediately after we moved in. On Halloween, my dad and I bought this huge pumpkin. We carved it and put it in our front window. We went out of town one night, and when we came back, that shit was smashed in the middle of our living room floor, 10 feet from where it had been sitting. I didn't think much of it because my dad played it off, but I heard him on the phone later with his new girlfriend, saying how freaky he felt it was. Then weird and random noises started happening pretty much every night, so much that we eventually got used to it. Even voices started being heard, but my dad always told me it was just the house settling. Yeah, I've never heard a house say the name Jeffrey when it settles, but that was what I would always hear when this voice was calling things out. There are 2 other messed up instances that happened that scared us into selling the place. A year later, my dad still talks about how this freaked him out. First, there was one night that we had a really bad storm. I was 10, so my dad was done letting me crawl into bed with him anymore. I had to brave that shit out on my own. But anyway, at about 3 in the morning, the storm was raging on and had been for a couple of hours. We heard a loud-ass boom from the first floor, and although our rooms were on the second, we heard glass shattering downstairs, too. My dad yelled at me to stay upstairs, and he went down to investigate. He came back up 20 minutes later and told me to just go back to sleep. It turns out our bay window had been blown out during the storm. The freaky part about that was, all of the glass was outside the house, not one shard in the living room. We got it fixed the next day, and we never mentioned it again. The second instance, we had a pull-down attic that was in the hallway between my bedroom and the basement. One night I woke up to go to the bathroom, and as I was walking down the hall, I ran into that fucking hanging attic door. My dad was sound asleep in his room, and that freaked me out. But as I was walking back to my room after my piss, I ran into that fucking attic door again. That's when I heard some rustling going on up there, and I figured it was my dad. So I once again walked past the attic towards his room, but he was in bed snoring. I freaked out, woke him up, and told him what was going on. He got up, turned on his bedroom light, and was very angry with me. We both looked into the hall, and even though the hallway light was off, we could tell the attic door was now closed. Like I said, my dad was pissed, and he just told me to go to bed and turned off his light. To this day, I still turn on every goddamn light upstairs in my current house when I have to pee, much to the dismay of my wife. Well, like I said, my dad and I moved soon after that, and I've never gone back to that place. The pillow. I was driving home from work late one night last month. It had been a long day, so I was already not feeling particularly sharp, especially since I had over an hour-long drive ahead of me. I was driving on the side street before I had to enter a highway, and with the exception of a few semi-trucks ahead of me, I was alone on the road. In the distance, probably 30 feet ahead of me, I saw this rather large brown object rolling alongside the road. I was going about 35 miles an hour, so it didn't take me long to get close to this rolling object. I was probably only about 5 feet from it, but because it was dark and I was trying to focus on the road, I couldn't quite make out what it was. As I was almost passing it, my mind took over trying to make sense of this strange thing rolling in a perfectly straight line down the road. And I thought to myself, is that a rock? And then immediately thought, that would be an awful thing to run over in the car, considering its size. I mean, it could have done some serious damage. But as I passed it, I was finally able to make out what it was. Lo and behold, it was a square throw pillow. You know, not like a couch cushion, but a plain brown decorative pillow, still rolling perfectly alongside my car, as if it were the first ever invented wheel defying all physics. Yeah, it was a square pillow. It kept rolling along until I had passed it and then was out of my sight. Although, how the fuck was a pillow rolling such a glorious straight line? And what chain of events happened to cause that occurrence? I knew on the drive home that that was the most ridiculous thing that I would ever likely see in my lifetime. On my drive back from work the next day, though, I saw the pillow on the side of the road. This time I stopped my car, put on my flashers, got out and grabbed the pillow and threw it in my trunk. I brought it home and placed it in a storage area near my parking spot. I didn't tell my fiancée I had done that because it was a filthy road pillow that I'd brought home. But strangely, 2 days later, it disappeared. Most likely I placed it too close to someone's parking spot and they took it for garbage. But I like to think it found its way out of my garage and that it's somewhere out there continuing to roll down the streets of America, mesmerizing drivers as much as it mesmerized me. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to unclejosh.truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you're watching this on YouTube and you're so inclined, maybe give it a thumbs up. Maybe even subscribe. Maybe even tell a friend about this channel. I'd appreciate it. Follow me on social media. I am now on TikTok, gag, but it's kind of fun and I love doing the shorts, which I have been uploading to YouTube as well as Instagram. If you'd like to take your support of this channel a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description, or consider purchasing some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my Patreon storefront is also in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.